Very good afternoon to all of you, and hope everybody had a good lunch. So I'm very happy to be part of today's Charity Governance Conference. So I hope to share as much as I can for the next half an hour today. Okay. So I'll start off by talking briefly about mission of charities, and purely because it is important for charities to fulfill their mission. And to fulfill their mission, I will talk about the importance of corporate governance and why corporate governance is actually key in order to build trust in the charity. I think this morning many of the speakers have said that trust is of paramount importance to charities because that's the criterion that donors and volunteers decide to put in their time and to help the charity. And I will also talk about effective risk management, why corporate culture plays a very important part in effective risk management. And last but not least, I will of course talk about internal audit, why having an internal audit function is actually very important, not only to the board, not only being the eyes and ears of the board, but also to help the charity to improve its processes, to make sure that they have good fraud control procedures, to help them improve their processes and procedures or improve efficiency and effectiveness. So, for charities, being a public entity, their stakeholders are no other than the general public and many other stakeholders. So the mission of charities is, of course, in philanthropy and social well-being, and in areas like education, religion, and charitable purposes would include health or saving lives, promoting arts and culture, advancing human rights, environmental protection, and animal welfare. So, who do you think are the stakeholders of charities? I would define stakeholders of charities as anybody or anyone who has actually benefited or has actually worked with charities. So, the stakeholders of charities are, of course, the public at large, the beneficiaries, the donors, the stakeholders and volunteers, funding agency, regulators, and its founders, and the board. So I think one of the main things that is important is for charities to make sure that they meet the expectations of stakeholders. So in meeting expectations of stakeholders, to me, I find the key areas that charities need to actually look at is being responsible, being accountable, being relevant, being transparent, being efficient and effective. So charities are strongly encouraged to apply the principles and practices of governance and management listed in the Code of Governance for Charities, an institution of public characters issued by the Charity Council. So what does being responsible mean? The board of directors and management has to fulfill the primary responsibility to ensure that the organization is accountable for its program and finances to the contributors, members, government, regulators, and other key stakeholders. Being accountable means fulfilling your obligation and as well as being willing to explain your actions to stakeholders. Being accountable also means acting in the best interests of the charity for its purposes. Transparency is an obligation or willingness by charity to publish and make available important, relevant, and critical data on a timely basis to its stakeholders. So, for charities, what does efficiency and effectiveness mean? Simply put, I guess efficiency is a wise use of resources. Efficient organizations are not wasteful and are well run. Effectiveness is, of course, associated with getting the job done and fulfilling aims, completing projects, running programs to achieve their goals. For efficient and effective management of resources and operations, it is important for charities to implement sound internal controls. I will elaborate a few later on what internal controls means, but simply put, it is a system of policies and procedures that safeguards assets and ensure accurate and reliable financial reporting, promoting compliance with laws and regulations, and achieving effective and efficient operations. I think many of the speakers have mentioned today that building trust is key for charities. So what is the standards of conduct for building trust? The standard of conduct for building trust under common law or the Companies Act includes exercising due care in all dealings, avoiding conflicts of interest, and obedience to the organization's central purpose, and which guides all the decisions made by the charity. I think among the people here, all of you must be are people who either oversee or manage the operations of charities, be it looking at the strategy of the charities, be it managing the day-to-day operations. So I'm sure, as charities, you face many challenges in navigating a dynamic environment and a multifaceted environment while trying to do more with less. Okay. Charities typically operate in a very lean environment, resulting in many areas that can go wrong, from gaps in your processes or non-compliance with key regulations or requirements, and maybe gaps in your system, or people who actually fail to follow procedures. So for charities, it's important to actually anticipate and address and manage issues promptly, as any failures in any parts of your operations can tarnish not only your reputation, but more important, your stakeholders' perception. So largely, the issues that charities will face can be categorized as strategic, IT, operational, financial, compliance, or governance related. Next, I will just share an example on elder care operations, looking at the nature of risk that the organization would probably have to deal with. The management and the board of the charity need to be always vigilant of the risks and proactively look into the organization's ability to recognize and respond effectively to risk. When we talk about strategic risk, what do we mean? Strategic risk could relate to risks of, for example, continuing or developing inappropriate programs and the failure to keep the organization strong and relevant as a charity. Governance risk. Governance risk occurs when there's ineffective oversight, for example, of management in making sure that policies and procedures are adequately laid down. They hire the right people to do the right job, for instance, or succession planning issues, or it could also be just tone at the top or culture issues within the organization. Next, one of the very common risks that I think all organizations and not only charities face would be to effectively deal with IT risks. For instance, system security being compromised, resulting in beneficiaries and donors' data being compromised. I think for most of us, that will be a complete nightmare, right? And this could have an adverse impact on the reputation of the charity. Other aspects of elder care operations in terms of operational risk could include things like service lapses, non-compliance with safety procedures, or negligent practices. And the list goes on with compliance risk, financial risk, and fraud risk. The Code of Governance for Charities and IPCs provides very good guidance by sharing recommended practices in these 9 areas on how effective charities should be governed and managed. Each and every of these areas are no less important to help charities to be more effective, transparent, and accountable. So the board as a whole is responsible to ensure compliance with the charity's governing instruments and all relevant laws and regulations. The board has to make sure that the charity is well run and operates responsibly so that charities will continue to be effective, credible, and sustainable. Next, I'll talk about meeting shareholders' expectations. I think these are the few key points that I would like to make that's really important for charity to take note of in order to meet stakeholders' expectations. Firstly, the governance structure with clear roles and responsibilities for ownership and accountability. An effective risk management framework should also be established with adequate and effective internal controls to mitigate financial, operational, financial, and IT risks. Thirdly, controllership and compliance monitoring function is essential as a second line of defense, and it should work alongside with the first line functions to help ensure that the risks and controls are effectively managed. And lastly, internal audit is necessary as a third line function that's objective and independent. Internal audit provides assurance to senior management and the board over the first and second line efforts to achieve effective risk management controls and governance processes. Maybe before I move on, how many of you here have at some point in time performed internal audit in your organizations? Maybe you can have a show of hands. Wow, that's a majority of you. That's very good. That's a good sign. Yeah. Okay. So I'll move on to talk about effective risk management. And the reason why I would like to stress on this is you'll find that increasingly, I think the board members realize that corporate culture actually plays a very important part. It can bring good outcomes and it can also bring bad outcomes. Okay. So under the internationally recognized COSO Enterprise Risk Management Framework, these are the 5 components for effective risk management. Firstly, governance and culture. Secondly, strategy and objective setting. Third, performance. Fourth, review and revision of the strategy. And lastly, information, communication, and reporting. I'll just briefly elaborate on 3 of the 5 components. The first part of it essentially is governance and culture. And governance actually sets the organization's tone and reinforces the importance of and establishes oversight responsibilities for enterprise risk management. And culture pertains to ethical values, the desired behavior, and understanding of the risk of that entity. So, for effective risk management, it is actually also very important for the strategy and objective to be set in order that it is clearly aligned to the vision and mission and core values of the organization. Information, communication, and reporting is a continual process of obtaining and sharing necessary information from both internal and external sources, which flows up and down the organizations and across the organization to make sure that management is aware, or the operations are aware of the internal and external environmental changes that can have an impact on their operations, for example. As I've mentioned earlier, boards are actually taking a closer look at corporate culture, purely because culture is an integral part of any company's success, or you can say failure, as it influences how the organization operates, from the highest level, strategic level thinking, and priorities to everyday behavior, decisions, and actions. Major corporate failures have been attributed to unhealthy cultures and value systems that support the promotion of self-interest, irresponsible management behavior, and misaligned strategy. For example, a dominant CEO that behaves like an emperor and no one can overrule him. That's a sign of a culture issue. Or a prevalent culture where people always find ways to circumvent policies, or ways to circumvent laws and regulation, or take shortcuts, and the mentality is always do first and worry later. So a lot of things can go wrong when the culture in the organization is not right. So what are the questions that board would want answered to get assurance on the corporate culture within the organization? So some other questions could be like, what steps have been taken to prevent or detect misconduct? Or how has the organization responded to the finding of an inappropriate or unethical behavior? Or are there clear expectations of what constitutes unacceptable behavior? And is that clearly understood by everyone within the organization? Is the workplace safe and respectful? Or do individuals feel like they can speak without retaliation, expect that they will be heard, and have their concerns investigated? So how do most organizations address the last point? I'm sure all of you have this, what you call whistleblowing arrangements, right? That provides a channel for internal and external party to provide or report feedback on any unfair treatment or any potential fraud. So the concept of culture is gaining traction in the boardroom, and directors are acutely aware that culture plays a role. So how do you think board assesses the organizational culture? Other than engaging operating personnel through either site visits or talking to second-line functions like compliance officer or human resources or health and safety personnel to assess culture, internal audit is actually a very important resource for the board to assess culture. Yeah. Next, I'll talk about internal controls. So internal controls can mean different things to different people, but most of us would think of internal controls as policies, procedures, and systems, right? But then there's actually a very important component of internal controls, which is really what we call soft controls. So I've given a few examples like tone at the top, the people within the organization, culture, shared values, commitment to competence. Commitment to competence purely means like people who are doing managing the operations or handling specific roles have to have the adequate necessary training and experience to do the job. Therefore, it is actually also management's responsibility to make sure that they actually hire the right people to do the job, and also making sure that people are trained to do the work that they are managing. So why do I say to sum it up, I think people is a very important element of internal controls. Why do we say that? The reality is that internal control, no matter how well it is designed and operated, it can be compromised. An internal control system is actually only as effective as the people who are responsible for its functioning. So even if an entity has a very effective system of internal control, but if you have a manager who's willing and able to override the controls, a lot of things can go wrong. And controls can also be circumvented by collusion of two or more people. And management can also override internal control systems. So, for internal auditors, basically, I think a lot of you would have dealt with your financial auditors. Some of you would have experience dealing with your internal auditors. You'll notice that the scope of internal audit is actually much, much wider than the financial auditors, because internal auditors look at every aspect of your operations, not just financial. Internal auditors actually, in making sure that they help the organization in looking at the effectiveness of the operations, internal auditors actually need to have a very, very good understanding of the strategic plans, the business plans of the charities, purely because they have to make sure that the internal controls, the risk management framework, policies and procedures are all well aligned to achieving the business, to achieving the organizational objectives. So one of the very important areas that internal auditors actually also help management to look at is also the organization's fraud risk management framework. I think very commonly charities face the risk of irregularities and fraudulent practices. So a good or effective fraud risk management program has to make up of preventive, detective elements and incident response as well to deal with the investigation protocols and enforcement and accountability of policies and procedures, and to do a root cause analysis. So if you look at the fraud risk management framework, other than robust internal controls, many of the preventive measures in mitigating fraud risk relate to people and conduct. For instance, hiring and supervision policies, code of conduct, communication and training, employee, and also one other aspect is on third-party due diligence, and this really relates to outsourced functions. How do you manage the risk of outsourced functions? And one of the risks of outsourced function is that the staff of outsourced service provider may not be very clear of the organization policies and procedure. How do you monitor compliance by the service provider staff? So to sum it up, good internal controls actually require competent, reliable, ethical staff and volunteers. Good internal controls require well-documented policies. Assignment of responsibilities is very important for accountability, for proper segregation of duties, so that there's no conflicting roles and functions. Good internal controls also require maintaining proper documentation and records, including electronic records. And part and parcel of good internal control system is really internal and external audits. And also within the management function, there must be adequate level of supervision and oversight and monitoring of work that's done by employees and volunteers. So, and then the other part is, of course, proper authorization processes. Okay. I'll move on to talk about how internal audit helps charities. Well, this is the definition of internal auditing by the Institute of Internal Auditors. So internal auditing is an independent, objective, assurance, and consulting activity. As you will note, it's not just only assurance, making sure that your financial reports are true and fair, but also consulting. Why do you think internal audit is a good consulting activity? As I mentioned earlier, internal audit actually looks at every aspect of the operations, including the strategy, the business plans, the systems, the people, the policies. So they actually have very good knowledge of the entire organization. Very often, different teams within the organization, they only know their own areas of work. So internal auditors are the ones that will help the organization to, to join the dots, to break the silos, and to look at where processes can be made more efficient or more effective on a cross-functional basis. Okay. And internal audit actually covers not only internal controls, internal audit also covers governance processes and risk management. So, an internal audit function can either actually be staffed by a personnel that's employed by the charity, or it can be outsourced to another organization to provide the internal audit support. So in forming the internal audit function, it's actually important to consider the reporting line, which is usually either directly to the audit committee or the board. So the reason is that the internal audit function should be independent of management of the charity so that they can provide an independent and objective assessment. Apart from looking at efficiency and effectiveness of the organization, its processes and its systems. So typically the decision for the appointment of internal auditors is one that flows from the board, and as noted above, that it relates to corporate governance. So where organizations have become more complex or have grown in diversity or in size, consideration must be given to perform regular internal audits. So next I'll move on to the value proposition of internal auditing for the stakeholders of charities. So these are the three areas in terms of value proposition of internal auditing: assurance, insight, and objectivity. I think most of you may be most familiar with the assurance portion because it talks about internal audit providing assurance on the adequacy of your governance processes, adequacy of your risk management processes, and internal control framework. Insights actually means that, in the course of performing internal audit work, internal auditors actually has a lot of knowledge about the processes and the operations within the charity. They have a good understanding of the operating goal and the objectives. They can actually provide analysis or assessments to the management of a charity on where resources can be deployed more efficiently or where the processes can be more effective. In short, internal audit is actually part and parcel of the organization's ongoing organizational improvements. Okay. The third part is, of course, objectivity, whereby it is an independent party that provides an independent assessment, and it actually provides not only the board, but other stakeholders of the charity with the assurance that the charity has got processes to make sure that there's proper reporting to all its stakeholders. The reporting is done on a timely basis, and really provides assurance to all stakeholders on the accountability of the charity. So, as a very minimum, I think when you first start off, when the organization thinks about having an internal audit function, I think one of the very first things that internal auditors can do is really do a health check for you to actually look at your governance, risk management, and internal control processes. So, and And the governing bodies and senior management actually relies on internal auditing to provide the assurance that they require on the operations of the charity, and to provide them with insights to improve controls, processes, procedures, and to help them to review areas where they can better manage their expenses or to also enhance performance. So largely I'll list down the roles of internal audit, and offering insight and advice means that, with the expertise and knowledge that the internal auditors have of internal controls, and also a broad perspective of the organization across all functions, they are a very good resource for consulting. For instance, let's say if you are implementing a new system, you can always actually seek advice from your internal auditors on what are the controls that you can build into your systems. So this is where they can offer their insights and advice. And by doing this, you can actually consider the risk upfront and build in the controls upfront. So internal auditors also help you to review and assess controls, and their job is basically to look at what are the potential risks that management may not have considered, to actually help you to take care of the blind spots, and also to look at your internal processes on how to better manage problem areas and also evaluate effectiveness and efficiencies. And one other very important role that internal auditors play is really to help promote ethics and also to help raise red flags where they discover potential fraud or improper conduct. I think this is very important to help management to deal with the issues before it gets bigger and before external parties get to know about the breakdown of lapses in controls. So, and internal auditors also do a lot of reviews on operations. These days, internal auditors are not just accountants. Internal auditors actually have from people who are from various disciplines. They can be people who are from operations. They can be people who are from IT. And that's the reason why, internal auditors are people who are actually, who has the necessary skill sets and experience to really help you in managing the operations and making sure that your operating goals and objectives are met. So internal audit, other than the second line function to help you with your monitoring of compliance, internal auditors actually is a very important third line function to help you assess compliance with applicable laws, regulations, contractual terms, and conditions. And of course, one other very important role of internal audit is to help the organization safeguard its assets, whether tangible or intangible. And internal audit is actually also a very good resource to help the organization for fraud investigations as well. So why do we say internal auditors are the eyes and ears of the board? First, I would like to summarize actually what's the role of internal auditors in governance as a whole. Basically, under the international standards of professional practices of Institute of Internal Auditors, the role of IA is basically to assess and make appropriate recommendations to improve the organization's governance processes for making strategic and operational decisions. They also look at the governance processes for overseeing risk management and internal controls, and internal auditors play an important role in helping to promote ethics and values in the organization. Internal auditors also help the organization to look at processes for ensuring effective organizational performance management and accountability. as well as communicating risk and control information to ensure that the appropriate areas are dealt with so that there's clear ownership as well. And also coordinating the activities and communicating information among the boards, the external, helping management to make sure that there's proper governance process to coordinate activities of communicating information between the board and the internal external auditors and other assurance providers and management. So, as the eyes and the ears of the board, basically IA is an independent objective function that reports directly to the board, and actually it's a resource that also helps both executive, management and board to ensure that the organization is held accountable to its stakeholders. Internal audit in doing the financial, in doing the operational reviews, in doing the compliance reviews, helps management to actually scan the internal and external environment for signs of trouble, and also it is more forward-looking as compared to, let's say, external audit reviews, in the sense that it looks at the horizon for any future challenges and risks. For instance, if a charity is rolling out a new program, it will actually look at the objectives of the program, what are the factors that can affect the outcome of the programs, and make recommendations to management if the existing measures are inadequate to manage those issues. On an overall basis, you can say that it really helps. Internal auditors also actually helps to keep an eye on the corporate culture, because in doing audits, we actually speak to people at all levels, and you may not see it in the internal audit reports, but actually with all the audits or the interactions that internal audit has with all levels of the organization, they have a very good feel actually of the ethical conduct or the operating culture within the organization itself. So as the eyes and the board of the director, one of the things that internal audit helps is really looking at whether the walk matches the talk, as in does senior management place a lot of importance on internal controls, or do they make it a point to enforce compliance with certain policies and procedure, or where things do not go well, management turn a blind eye to it and do not take the necessary actions to correct the gaps or take the necessary remediation measures. So, and therefore, internal audit is a very important resource, because by looking at your governance, risk management, internal controls, it helps protects the reputation of charities by identifying any internal control weakness or operating efficiencies or wasteful spending, fraud, or non-compliances with laws and regulations. So, as earlier mentioned, internal auditors evaluate every aspect of the organization. So it really helps management in flagging out areas that they may not be aware of, and also help to raise potential red flags. So in short, I would say that internal auditors are really the guardians of integrity, as it provides the board with an unvarnished perspective on what's happening in the risk management, financial accounting, and internal control systems of the organization. So I'll end off by sharing a few case studies that demonstrates the importance of internal audit to cast an eye on the internal control environment, culture, and ethical climate, and what are the baseline requirements for robust and effective internal controls. Okay, this case here, the first case I have here is essentially a case that took place, that happened in the US. Okay. This doctor by the name of Lawrence Nasser is a former USA gymnastics national team doctor and also an osteopathic physician at the Michigan State University. So the USA Gymnastics is the national governing body for gymnastics in the US. He was sentenced in January 2018 for, you can imagine, it's hard to believe, 40 to 175 years in prison for sex crimes after more than 60 women testified against him in court. So much of the criticism actually centered on the Michigan State U, which employed Dr. Nasser and received reports of sexual abuse by him as early as 1990. So the unfortunate case is that in this case, there were indications whereby the organizations and the people who could have stopped Dr. Nasser did not take any action to actually to address the issues. So this former Olympics Games director was actually accused of sexually abusing hundreds of young people over a period of 2 decades. And the organizations actually failed to question and alert the law enforcement for his improper behavior. And this doctor has always enjoyed a high social reputation, and he was lauded as one of the must-see doctor who works for America's best gymnasts. So what are the learning points or issues here? So within the organization, there was clearly a lack of enforcement in the code of conduct, and actions were not taken to address serious reports of improper behavior, or rather, the reports of improper behavior was not channeled to the right level for it to be addressed. So the establishments, which is the Michigan State University and the USA America Gymnastics, actually failed to look after the interests and well-being of its beneficiaries. So student athletes who were abused felt they were betrayed by these institutions. As a result, the Michigan State University president had to resign under pressure, and the USA Gymnastics also announced that various board members have actually stepped down, including the chairman. And various organizations like AT&T, Procter & Gamble, Hershey's, Under Armour, Kellogg's have all declined to renew and ended their sponsorships with the USA Gymnastics. So what is IA's role in the organization? In such cases, as we all know, it would have been important to establish whistleblowing channels to both internal and external parties to make sure that the concerns are elevated to the right level for it to be addressed. So an independent party also should review the whistleblowing incidents to make sure that there's proper follow-up. So internal audit as a resource are also actually very frequently asked to maintain the hotlines or the emails for whistleblowing to make sure that it is, reviewed as an independent party and channeled to, the relevant party to actually make sure that the issues are properly addressed. So I'll look at, next case is just a local case whereby you have an NPO who had this fundraising project, and things went wrong when one of the finance department administrative assistant actually misappropriated close to 100,000 over a course of a year. And the person actually started working as a temporary staff before she was made a permanent staff. So the discrepancies actually surfaced only after an internal audit. So as a result, the fundraising activities had to be stopped, and investigations were actually performed into the misappropriation of funds. So what are the issues and learning points here? Well, I think we all know that robust internal controls, especially in areas where cash is handled, is very important. And robust internal controls or baseline internal controls in this area would mean, having well-documented policies, making sure that there's proper segregation of duties, assigning reliable and ethical staff and volunteers to manage cash, making sure that there's appropriate assignment of responsibilities with the required levels of supervision, and tight monitoring checks to ensure that cash is properly accounted for. So with actually internal audit, they can actually do a very good assessment for you to make sure that the controls are put in place. And of course, we all know that even though you have the best controls, the only thing that can go wrong is the people who are actually performing the functions. So in this case, there's also the issue of whether you make sure that you hire the right people on board. Do you do a background checks? And these are all part and parcel of the fraud risk management framework that I earlier mentioned. So the IA's role is really to help management to regularly assess the control requirements, looking at the risk areas, looking at your fraud control programs. So I'll end off with just one last case. This is a case on personal data protection. It's a UK case that involves a breach in personal data and confidentiality of donor information. So the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals and the British Heart Foundation had actually shared donor details and secretly pried into their wealth. They also took part in a scheme to share and swap personal data with other charities to get details of more people to contact and ask for donations. So the donors were actually not informed of these practices, and so they were unable to consent or object. So if you look at this case, it is actually just not a breach of conduct, but it's also unethical practice. So in general, such situations will be attributable to perhaps one of the following causes, like shown at the top, or lack of awareness or emphasis on the importance of data protection and its compliance requirement, and also lack of monitoring and oversight on partnership programs. So in terms of IA roles, IA actually will typically also review the adequacy of internal controls on personal data protection as well as the compliance management framework. So basically the review typically would involve looking at how the charity, whether the charity has established policies and procedures to govern data collection, the use of data, the management and storage of personal data. Okay, so that's all I have to share today. So, yeah, thank you.